You wander into a crumbling courtyard. It smells of rusted hinges, old hay, and scorched earth. A single piece of chalk sits on the ledge of a shattered window, waiting. The sun's just beginning to dip behind the low hills, casting a glow so golden it almost makes the dirt look holy. And tonight, you're going to follow the footsteps of women who looked at broken buildings and didn't see failure. They saw a classroom. They didn't wait for permits. They didn't ask for recognition. They grabbed what they had aboard, a bell, a few scraps of string, and got to work. Not in famous cities with marble libraries, but in forgotten villages where the roads didn't even get names. One woman even used a barn that still smelled faintly of cow dung. Don't worry. She got used to it after a week. And you know what? You wouldn't have survived the first 5 minutes of that barn school. No fan, no Wi-Fi, and a rooster that would not shut up during reading time. But still, she taught, because if she didn't, no one would. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trail after her, our chalk-wielding pioneer, across a dirt yard as she unbars the door to what used to be a stable. There's no official curriculum here. No funding. No desks, just 4 kids sitting cross-legged on potato sacks. The youngest clutches a stick instead of a pencil. There's no paper. So they write in ash, spread across a wooden board. This is what makeshift education looked like in war-torn countryside France. 1916. Soldiers had taken the real school. The teacher, a widow who'd once taught Sunday school. Her name never made it into textbooks. But she taught subtraction beside the chicken coop and used nursery rhymes to explain fractions. She even turned a broken door into a blackboard. Historians still argue whether rural pop-up schools like hers really impacted literacy levels long-term, but that debate never visited her barn. The air inside smells of dry hay and chalk dust, and every corner creaks with stories. You imagine sitting in that room, sunlight slicing through the slats, the faint bleating of a goat in the distance. The teacher's voice is steady, not loud, like she's convincing the room itself that learning is still possible. But she wasn't the first, and definitely not the last. In post-Meiji Japan, around the 1880s, rural women began organizing what were called Terracotta temple schools, revived for common children. Some were technically illegal at the time, because the state wanted more control over curriculum. But women, many of whom couldn't even write their own names yet, opened their homes anyway. They would read aloud from old merchant manuals, pass around inkstones, and teach children how to sign their names, not for poetry, but for property rights. You pause at one of those early homes-turned-schools. Its paper walls faded to yellow. The scent of green tea mixes with ink, and an old woman in layered cotton kneels by a fire pit, helping a girl trace kanji in sand with a bamboo twig. That's right, sand. It was reusable, cheap, and didn't smudge like charcoal. 1 pot of water, 1 good patch of sand, and a dream. Back in West Africa, sometime in the early 20th century, you find yourself beneath the shade of a wide baobab tree. A woman named Diana, barefoot and bold, teaches numbers using river pebbles and patterns woven into cloth. She doesn't just teach math, she teaches trade. Her school is a semicircle of kids balancing on carved stools. using rhythm to memorize conversions between seeds, grain, and spices. Quirky fact: she once used cola nuts as both counting tools and end-of-class treats. That's how she kept attendance up. Her story echoes through history's silence. Colonizers dismissed these gatherings as informal instruction, but for the children of Ayana's village, they were nothing less than survival. Your mind drifts to a woman in early Depression-era America, who turned the back of her laundromat into a reading room. Between loads of sheets and the smell of bleach, she kept a box of tattered books beside the soap. She let kids read as long as they didn't smudge the pages. Legend says she taught over 30 kids to read that way. You think she cared whether anyone from the Board of Education ever visited? Please, and here's where it gets tricky. Historians still debate whether these women were resisting systems or merely coping within them. Were they quiet revolutionaries? Or just practical caretakers? But for the kids with no other classroom, the answer didn't matter. The real revolution was in the daily act: unlocking the door, smoothing out the sackcloth, calling roll from memory. Because these weren't just lessons, they were lifelines. For every student that learned to write a letter, there was one less silent voice in the world. For every kid who discovered they could spell freedom, there was one more future changed. And let's not ignore the wild details. One Polish teacher in 1945 used cigarette cartons to make flashcards. A woman in rural Chile taught geometry by carving shapes into dried cactus skins. And a girl in Vietnam, barely older than her students, used rice grains and chopsticks to diagram the solar system. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. You sit with these stories now, surrounded by chalk dust, chicken feathers, echoes of forgotten names. This wasn't charity. This was survival with a lesson plan. You think of the quote: when you teach a child, you change a village. But in these stories, when you teach a child, you change everything. The first section closes with the image of a woman turning off her oil lamp. Her hands are cracked from cleaning the floor with river water, but her chalk is still in her pocket. Tomorrow, she'll be back. The walls are damp, not with rain, but with breath the heavy, anxious kind that fills a space meant for 5, but now holds 20. You step into a converted cellar beneath an abandoned inn. There are no signs, no doors that stay unlocked, no welcome mats. But you're here because this was once a shelter, maybe still is. And it was women who made it one. During wars, especially the ones with numbers World War I. World War II orphans weren't rare. They were statistics, filed under displacement and collateral loss. But you wouldn't know that from the way these women tucked each child into stolen blankets as if they were their own. They didn't just provide roofs, they gave rituals. Morning porridge, a song before sleep, a safe corner where no one screamed. You lean down. The floor's covered in layered fabric curtains, scarves, torn shirts stitched into a patchwork carpet to soften the cold. The walls are stuffed with straw behind the panels for insulation. And that mattress, stuffed potato sacks. Not great on the back, but 100 times better than cobblestones. You meet one of them in 1944 Naples. Italy, Giulia. Her husband died in the Allied bombings. Her children, 2. She had every reason to collapse. Instead, she began pulling orphaned children off the streets. She cleaned out a bombed-out bakery and used the brick oven to keep the shelter warm. When she ran out of food, she begged at army checkpoints. When they laughed, she came back the next day, She taught the children to sweep, to sing, to whisper quietly during raids. She made rules like bedtime and wash your socks. Sounds trivial, but it gave the kids rhythm, and rhythm is what grief can't easily ruin. Quirky tidbit. She taught every child to whistle one unique tune like little musical fingerprints so she could keep track of them when they scattered during air raid sirens. Of course, not everyone called her a hero. Some neighbors whispered that she was hoarding food. Others said she was crazy. Historians still argue whether such informal, female-led shelters helped or hindered the efficiency of post-war recovery efforts. Bureaucracy never liked being outperformed. You sit near the fireplace where she once stirred broth with a broken broom handle. She called it survival soups and beans. Maybe a potato, if she was lucky. Water thickened with bread crusts. But she always found a way to feed them all, even if it meant she didn't eat. Across the world, in Soviet Ukraine during the Holodomor famine, a woman named Nadia opened her barn to children left behind. She wove together wheat sacks into blankets and fed the kids dried beet pulp stolen from the back of a kolkhoz cart. She didn't ask where the kids came from. She just made room. One survivor later wrote, "She smelled like hay and honey, and I knew I was safe." Meanwhile, in Harlem, New York, during the Great Depression, a woman named Ruth Ellis used her paycheck from cleaning houses to rent 2 rooms for girls kicked out for being too different. She gave them cots, books, and Sunday breakfast. The city never registered it as a shelter, but dozens of women later said that place saved their lives. Some still visit her grave. What tied them all together? Not the bricks, not the funding, they had none. It was the insistence that no child should sleep in the cold, even if it meant sharing the only bowl of soup, even if it meant risking arrest. There's something profound about how they fixed the world with nothing but thread, leftovers, and sheer willpower. They didn't wait for policies. They didn't submit grant proposals. They patched holes in the ceiling with tin cans and optimism. You passed through one such shelter in Cambodia, set up during the Khmer Rouge purges. It was underground, literally. A group of women, including one named Meili, dug into the clay beneath a farmhouse. They called it the cradle hole. There were no lights, just candles, no medicine, just herbs. But within that darkness, babies were born and children slept, quiet as ghosts. Fringe historians insist such shelters exaggerate their own success, that saving 10 out of 100 is still failure. But that's easy to say when you weren't the 11th child saved by a woman holding a matchstick for warmth. And the methods, absolutely bonkers. Sometimes, in rural Romania, one woman disguised her shelter as a tavern. Loud music upstairs. Children studying geometry below. In Egypt, a widow used her late husband's fishing boat as a floating orphanage. Anchored it in the Nile. Taught algebra between the reeds. You crouch beside a shelf made of apple crates and see a row of tiny boots. Worn soles turned upward to dry. Each boot once walked through fire or famine. Each was cleaned by someone who refused to let a child grow up feral. The air is thick with something else. Not just dust or history, but memory. The kind of memory that sticks to the walls. You wonder how they did it, how they didn't give up. But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the real wonder is that they didn't expect a reward. No medals, no documentaries, just the occasional smile. Or the moment a child finally said their name again without stuttering. These shelters weren't sanctuaries in the religious sense. They were miracles in motion, one child at a time. One patched sock, one whispered lullaby beneath falling bombs. You leave the shelter quietly, stepping over a cracked floorboard. Above you, stars blink through broken roof tiles. The night hums softly, and the shelter sleeps. Not perfect, not finished, but still here. The sun bakes the horizon flat, the sand shimmering like it's trying to levitate. You wipe your brow. Not that it helps, and follow a group of children walking barefoot along a dusty path. Their feet barely raise a puff of earth. They're headed to school, though you wouldn't recognize it as one. No walls, no roof, just the oldest tree in the village, casting enough shade to fit a circle of squirming bodies. And under that tree, a woman, seated on a mat, her voice clear and calm. You settle into the dust nearby, and it's almost like the heat fades when she speaks. This is where the quiet work of indigenous women teaching under colonial rule begins, and it's both beautiful and quietly rebellious. In parts of North Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Australian outback during the height of colonial regimes, formal schooling was often used as a tool for assimilation. Indigenous languages, discouraged, sometimes banned outright. Native histories, rewritten. So women like this one, let's call her Asha, decided to do what the government wouldn't. She opened her classroom under a neem tree. The only requirements: show up, bring something to sit on, and be ready to learn. She's teaching in a language colonial officials would rather see erased. It's not just education, it's resistance with a syllabus. Today, she's sharing folk tales about a river spirit who outwits a greedy merchant. But tucked inside the story, math, morals, geography. Asha folds lessons into rhythm, into chants, into games. There's no blackboard here, only lines drawn in the sand with a stick. When the wind blows them away, she simply draws again. Historians still argue whether this non-formal education system preserved more native knowledge than formal ones destroyed. But you watch a boy trace a river's course into the dirt with perfect memory, and the answer feels pretty clear. There's a basket beside her mat, filled with gourds, beads, even dried animal dung, which she uses to explain trade weights. Not as a snack. Thankfully, Asha teaches children how to count, trade, even debate. Yes, debatey. They take turns arguing whether a leopard or a hawk is a better hunter. The winner earns the right to hold the thinking stick next time. No grades, no detentions, just learning wrapped in rhythm. You follow this story to 1930s Australia, where Aboriginal women known as songline mothers passed down sacred geography through song. Colonial administrators called it superstition. Anthropologists later realized these women were literally teaching maps, land ownership, and resource routes. One fringe scholar insists some of these oral maps were more accurate than the ones printed in colonial offices. Of course, they didn't have longitude. They had lyrics. You lean back, eyes half-lidded, and listen to one of these women sing. Her voice is low and strong, naming rock formations, waterholes, and spirit crossings in a melody you can't replicate, only feel. Children chant back, and in doing so, they learn how not to die in the desert. That's not just culture, it's survival science. Elsewhere, in French Indochina, a woman named Trin ran a secret classroom out of her rice store. During the day, it was all sacks and scales. But after hours, the kids came in pairs, careful not to attract attention. She taught Vietnamese script, forbidden at the time, by carving words into dried palm leaves. She told stories about ancestral kings, poems about the river, even songs that snuck encoded history, quirky detail. Trinh trained a parrot to mimic numbers in Vietnamese, which she used to teach arithmetic. It drove her neighbor nuts, but the kids adored it. They called it the feathered professor. You wonder, sitting there in the shade, what made these women risk everything? Arrest, ridicule, sometimes worse. But the truth is, they didn't frame it as risk. It was duty, like brushing your teeth. You just did it, because who else would? You catch wind of another story, this one, from the Berber highlands of Morocco. A woman named Fatima created quilting circles where women would meet to sew, gossip, and underneath it all, teach girls how to read and write in tifanas, the ancient Berber script. Colonial inspectors thought it was harmless homemaking. But Fatima's students left those circles with full vocabularies and stitched verses hidden in their blankets. Historians still debate whether such coded classrooms should be counted as educational spaces or cultural preservation zones. You wonder why it has to be either. Maybe it's both. Maybe a warm blanket and a poem are sometimes the same thing. And the heat? Don't even start. You're drenched just sitting here, imagining how Asha never even breaks a sweat. One scholar once joked that these women had iron patience and ceramic spines bending without breaking, steady under the sun. You remember now how modern schools often boast open-air classrooms as if it's a design innovation. Asha's been doing that since before roads had names. Her chalkboard is the earth. Her projector, the movement of birds overhead. Her lesson plan, whatever the children need that day. And it works. You take a deep breath as class ends. Children help pack up the few items: threaded beads, empty baskets, gourd spoons, and kiss Asha's hands before scampering away. There's no bell, just the wind shifting direction. You stand, dust clinging to your legs, and watch as she wipes away the lessons drawn in sand. But the kids, they carry it all in their bones now, in their steps, in the way they hum the river song on their walk home. This isn't nostalgia. This is memory that breathes. Education without buildings. Wisdom without permits. All built by women who didn't wait to be told they were qualified. And as the wind rises again, clearing the chalk dust trails, you realize the classroom might vanish each evening, but the lessons don't. The planks creak beneath your feet, swaying just enough to make your stomach flutter. Beneath you, the dark water slaps lazily at bamboo stilts, and the scent of riverweed tangles with distant wood smoke. You're standing in a classroom, but not the kind with lockers or tiled floor. This one floats. Welcome to the floating schools of the Mekong Delta, Tonle Sap, and parts of Bangladesh and Nigeria. These are schools built on water by women who refuse to let floods, monsoons, or geography decide whether a child got to learn. You duck inside a long, low shack built entirely from salvaged bamboo, fishnet, tarp, and rusted tin. Inside, the floor rocks gently with every passing breeze. It smells of wet wood, dried fish, and chalk. You sit beside a boy swinging his legs over the edge. His desk is a plank nailed between two crates. No walls here, just tarpaulin stretched taut and flapping softly. And the teacher, her name is Lien, a grandmother who once farmed rice and now teaches kids to read between the tides. When floods destroyed the village school for the third year in a row, she looked at an old fishing barge and said, "Well, it floats. Let's start there." That barge became a school. A loud, damp, beautiful mess of a school. Her husband thought she was joking. So did the village chief. But when she sailed past his house one morning with 10 kids reciting vowels, he stopped laughing. Historians still argue whether floating schools are sustainable interventions or temporary hacks. But you don't feel temporary sitting here as Lean holds up a page torn from a newspaper and teaches children how to write their names with charcoal dipped in river water. They use banana leaves as erasers. The occasional fish jumps through a gap in the boards. Nobody blinks. This school isn't government approved. It isn't on any official registry, but it moves with the community, docking wherever families drift. During the dry season, Lien ties the school to a cypress tree. During the wet months, it floats from hamlet to hamlet. It's the opposite of what modern education promises, permanence. And yet, here it is resilient, soggy, and entirely alive. You peek at the blackboard, actually, a slab of painted tin roof propped between poles. Today's lesson is on rainfall cycles. It's ironic, because the school is currently floating inside one. Lien explains weather patterns by pointing at clouds and using the rising waterline as a ruler. Talk about immersive learning. In Nigeria's Makuku community, you'd find something eerily similar. A woman named Ngozi built her school out of plastic bottles sealed and lashed under wood planks. Local officials thought it was a joke until it survived 3 floods while the cement school collapsed. Quirky tidbit. She taught swimming lessons as part of her curriculum, so kids wouldn't drown on the way to spelling tests. Smart? Right. Floating schools are noisy. The boards groan. Boats splash past. And sometimes frogs show up uninvited. But they're also full of laughter, song, and the occasional math problem shouted over a storm. One teacher in Bangladesh rigged a wind-powered radio to broadcast lessons when waves made docking impossible. Another attached water jugs to chairs so they'd float if capsized. You feel the boat shift again as Lien opens a lunch pail rice, pickled veggies, and dried shrimp. She shares with the children. You imagine the classroom on land. Maybe it would be quieter, maybe drier. But you'd lose the sway, the rhythm, the feeling of being quite literally afloat in possibility. And it's not just schools that float shelters do too. In flood-prone provinces, women have converted boats, rafts, and even hollowed out barrels into safe havens. They lash mosquito nets around benches. They tie up with coconut fiber. When cyclones sweep through, it's women who lead kids to these buoyant sanctuaries, humming lullabies as thunder cracks overhead. You recall the woman in the Philippines who built her entire orphan shelter from scrap styrofoam and used bamboo to anchor it. It looked ridiculous, but it kept 30 children dry during Typhoon Bopa in 2012. That woman never trained as an architect, just stubborn as driftwood. Some scholars insist floating schools are just romanticized, poverty, quaint but inefficient. Others argue they represent a radical shift toward adaptive infrastructure. But again, you see children learning, not drowning. You see women building, not begging. And that says enough. You trail your fingers in the water. watching the ripples slide under the floating platform. Imagine learning multiplication while your classroom rocks like a lullaby. Imagine spelling bees, where the winner gets to sit closest to the boat's bow for the best breeze. Imagine growing up where knowledge literally floats to you. These women didn't just build schools, they redefined what a school could be. Not anchored, not static, but as fluid as life itself. You hear a giggle behind you. A girl's drawn a fish wearing glasses on the chalkboard tin. Lian laughs, tousles her hair, and erases it gently with her sleeve. The girl pouts, but returns to her lesson. You don't need polished desks for moments like that. You just need enough planks to hold the laughter. As dusk creeps in, Lion drops anchor an old engine block tied to a tire. The children begin to scatter, hopping into rowboats or swimming toward homes that bob gently in the distance. Lanterns flicker on, one by one. Fireflies join in. The classroom empties. The water settles. And for a moment, it's just you, Lian, in the silence of a lesson well taught. The school rocks like a cradle. And maybe it is cradling a generation in the arms of a woman who simply refused to let learning sink. The floor is dirt. The roof is a tarp. And the walls are, well, optional. A rooster struts between scattered sandals, and a toddler is asleep on someone's lap in the corner. You duck your head as you step into the makeshift school, bumping into a low-hung wire where laundry flaps beside a hand-painted alphabet chart. There's a board, a box, and a bell. And somehow, that's all she needed. The woman at the front claps her hands not loudly, but enough to hush the noise and the students still, sitting in neat rows on the ground. Her name is Miriam. No last name, no official title. She's the founder, the janitor, the teacher, the lunch lady. In the chaos of a newly settled refugee camp, she's the reason this shack has become a school. You've heard the phrase, start small. But this is microscopic. One box, full of scavenged pencils, some dull enough to be considered sticks. One board, a plywood slab someone fished out of a drainage ditch, now propped up by cinder blocks. And the bell. It's not a bell. It's a spoon striking a rusted cooking pot. And yet, here they are, kids reciting the days of the week in 3 languages, laughing when someone mispronounces Wednesday. There's joy here, squeezed into a space the size of a single-car garage, built entirely from found materials and fierce will. Back in the 1980s, during the height of displacement in El Salvador, a woman named Soledad opened a school like this. Her village had been bombed out, the roads mined, and the men mostly gone. Soledad hauled bricks on her back for weeks, dragging corrugated metal from the edge of town. She didn't wait for peace. She started class with 5 kids under a fig tree. 10 years later, over 100 students called that place their first school. Historians still argue whether such efforts constituted real education or just community morale. Builders. But the children who learned to write their names would tell you there's nothing pretend about it. You squat beside the board and examine today's lesson. It's a story about a turtle who builds his own house. Slow but steady, shell by shell. The children are drawing their own turtles in charcoal on old rice sacks. One girl has added a roof and a smiley face. Another's turtle has glasses. You're struck by the creativity bursting through the narrow cracks of poverty. And here's a fun tidbit. In some West African villages, teachers used cassava peels for writing practice. Peels scraped clean, dried and written on with charcoal. When the lesson ended, the peels were tossed into the cooking pot for dinner. Zero waste education. Miriam calls for break, and the kids file out like it's recess in a palace courtyard. She takes that time to sweep the floor, rearrange the water jugs, and reposition the tarp that's threatening to fly away in the breeze. You ask how long she's been doing this. She smiles, shrugs, and says, "Since I had one box." You follow a thread to post-partition India, where a woman named Zara set up a roadside school with even less, just a chalk line on a wall. She taught spelling by pointing to signs, to car parts, to vendor stalls. Her students learned by scavenging the letters around them. Quirky. She once used old train tickets as reading flashcards handed out during class, then reused for actual travel. Later, in Sierra Leone, during the Ebola crisis, schools shut down completely. One woman, Mariama, turned her porch into a blackboard hub, writing daily math problems on a plank nailed to her railing. Children came in shifts to copy them down. She never touched the kids, never let them gather. But she taught through distance before Zoom was even a word. That board saved months of lost learning. And still, the question echoes, is this a school? Where are the uniforms, the textbooks, the inspectors? But you feel the answer hum in your chest as a boy runs back in, shouting, "I know how to spell turtle now," and holds up his drawing like it's a diploma. You look around and notice other items repurposed into educational gold. Bottle caps sorted by color for math. A shoe rack turned into a bookshelf. Flattened tins etched with shapes for geometry. There's even a tiny globe made from a painted coconut shell. This is a palace, not of stone, but of intention. You crouch near a wall that barely holds. There's a strip of paper listing class rules. Rule 1, we help. Rule 2, we share. Rule 3, we try again. Simpler than any school mission statement you've ever seen, and probably more effective. Later in the day, you catch Miriam teaching English phrases by holding up objects and singing about them. This is a spoon. It goes clink, clink, soon. It's ridiculous. It's effective. One boy joins in with a drum beat on his knees. And soon, the whole class is a choir of kitchenware. Somewhere nearby, a generator rumbles to life. The power grid is unreliable, but Miriam doesn't notice. She's too busy reading a folk tale about a girl who plants a mango seed and grows a forest. You wonder if she knows that she's doing the same. You step outside as the sun slants low. The bell rings again, spoon. Put. Clang. The kids leave, tugging each other's sleeves and singing the spoon song. The room empties. The box gets shut. The board gets leaned against the wall. But the school, it's not over. It'll be back tomorrow. One box, one board, one bell, and a woman who decided that waiting for help wasn't an option. The scent hits you first, something between incense and damp stone. You're not in a house or a school now, but a crumbling shrine at the edge of a forest, tucked behind a village that hasn't had a working post office in years. The temple walls are cracked, overgrown with moss, and laced with vines like nature's own handwriting. But behind its faded archways, someone has swept the floor clean. There are mats laid out in rows, shoes lined up at the door, and in one corner, a girl reads aloud from a book that wasn't printed in this century. This place isn't abandoned. It's been reclaimed. You've stumbled into one of the many shelters turned sanctuaries by women who refuse to let society discard the most vulnerable. Widows, unmarried mothers, midwives, girls cast out for reasons too absurd to repeat. In a world where tradition often shut doors, they pried open forgotten ones and made them home. You spot her Auntie Reha, as everyone calls her, tending to a girl's bandaged foot near the old altar. She's not a priestess or a doctor. She's just there. And somehow, that's enough. Years ago, after being pushed out of her husband's family for being bad luck, she found this neglected shrine and moved in. Alone at first, then another woman joined, then two more. Now, it's a full house of exiles turned educators. They don't advertise, they don't apologize. They just welcome. The lessons here aren't algebra or grammar. They're how to boil rice safely, how to hold your ground when a man yells, how to sew your own clothes from discarded saris. They teach girls how to breathe in their own space, how not to shrink. Quirky touch. They've painted stories on the temple walls, murals of heroines from forgotten epics, warrior queens, rebellious goddesses. The stories aren't quite canonical, but they are spellbinding. One fresco shows a woman riding a tiger through a city made of fire. According to Reha, she represents any girl who ever ran from a bad marriage and didn't look back. In medieval Kerala, widows were often confined or sent to ashrams with strict codes. But some broke the rules, banded together, and opened informal learning circles in deserted prayer halls. Historians still argue whether these spaces were proto-schools or spiritual retreats. Maybe both. But the women who passed through them learned to read, write, and more importantly, speak. You sit in on a session. A young girl reads poetry out loud while another spins thread in the corner. An old woman sharpens a pencil with a knife worn to a nub. There's no curriculum, no bill, no good morning, ma'am, just a low hum of stories, whispers, and boiling tea. And there's healing. Two, in one corner, you see a cloth doll with a missing eye. A girl clutches it during quiet time, and you realize it's probably the only thing she owns that's never left her. These shelters weren't built for recovery programs or therapy sessions. They were built for presence, for simply staying when everyone else left. You remember the story of Marie-Thérèse in Haiti, a midwife who turned her cousin's ruined voodoo temple into a shelter after the 2010 earthquake. The village called her mad, but within weeks, girls came to stay. She offered food, herbs, and a cot. She also taught basic French literacy using song lyrics scratched into driftwood. One of her students later became a local school teacher herself. And then there's Sayaka in post-war Okinawa, who turned an old, bombed-out Shinto shrine into a safe house for girls working in the black market. She cooked seaweed soup every morning, taught them to read signs and contracts, and helped them send letters to distant siblings. Fringe historians claim the U. Occupation forces ignored the site because they assumed it was too feminine to be political. Sayaka preferred it that way. You glance up at the old temple's beams, once blackened by candle soot, now hung with paper lanterns shaped like birds. Each bird has a name written on its wing, a girl who left the shelter and made it. Somehow. Reha says the birds carry their names to the wind, and if the girls ever lose their way, the wind will remember. Outside, the world still frowns at women like these. They're called improper, broken, too loud. But here, inside cracked walls and under prayer flags stitched from scraps, they are whole. You hear someone giggle in the back, one girl pretending her broom is a sword. Another makes up a chant to go with her sweeping. Sweep out the sorrow. Sweep in the light. The others join in, just for the fun of it. These are classrooms. Make no mistake. They just swapped desks for floor mats and swapped textbooks for trust. You notice a shelf stacked with items. Turmeric, candles, bits of chalk, folded cloths, and a dented tin full of donated pens. It's a toolbox for building lives. Not big ones. Not perfect ones, but safe ones. One scholar once dismissed places like this as pseudo-institutions. But you can't help but wonder, if pseudo-institutions raise real girls into real women with real strength, maybe it's the institutions that are playing catch-up. Dusk settles. Someone lights a clay lamp and sets it by the door. The girls begin folding up their mats. One thanks Reha with a hug that doesn't let go for a long time. Another lingers by the mural of the tiger-riding woman and touches the painted flame. The lesson ends. But the shelter doesn't. These women will stay, keeping the light on for the next girl who needs it. And the temple, cracked and overgrown as it is, has never stood taller. You feel the crunch of broken glass under your shoe. Careful. This was a classroom once, though now the roof's gone. And vines are doing their best to reclaim what war tried to erase. You duck through the gaping doorway, where a rusted school bell lies half buried in ash. The walls are pocked with bullet holes. A blackboard leans against the far side, cracked down the middle, but still legible. The date, frozen in time, reads May 10th, 1943. And yet, against all odds, someone has laid a mat on the floor. There's a basket of chalk, a wooden stool. You're not alone here. You meet her in the stillness, Annika, or Tante Annika to her students. In the aftermath of bombings, when teachers were either gone or hiding, she walked into this ruin, swept out the debris, and declared it open. Her school wasn't listed on any registry. Her salary, whatever neighbors could spare bread, buttons, sometimes just thanks. But what she gave was structure. And in a broken world, structure is sacred. These classrooms built in the bones of bombed-out buildings were not rare. From Rotterdam to Rangoon, from Warsaw to Hiroshima, women stepped through smoking rubble and started teaching again. Historians still argue whether this instinct to rebuild schools before anything else was strategic or emotional. But if you ask the children who returned to sit on crates and learn multiplication beneath tarpaulin ceilings, they'd say it mattered. Annika's story unfolds like a quiet miracle. She used debris to rebuild walls. Burnt doors became benches. She stitched together curtains from salvaged cloth, not for vanity, but to block the wind that howled through shattered windows. She scavenged textbooks from train stations and rewrote pages by hand when the originals were too charred to read. You take a seat on an upturned bucket as Annika begins class. Today's subject, geography. She draws Europe's outline in ash on the wall with her finger, pauses, and gently says, "This part here, this was lost, but we still remember its shape." In Berlin, 1945, a woman named Jute reopened a school with 3 surviving chairs and 24 children. Her classroom had no roof. Her students brought umbrellas. When it rained, they held them up together, still reciting poetry. In Nagasaki, a few months after the bomb. A teacher named Aya used a flattened tin sheet for a chalkboard. She wrote lessons with white pebbles dipped in water. The city around them was dust and bone, but she taught anyway. She had one intact reader and a collection of children's haikus that somehow survived the blast. Quirky fact. She called her makeshift class the School of Ashes and kept a box of paper cranes on the corner of her desk. Back in Anika's ruined school, she opens a drawer, not really just a crate filled with children's drawings. You hold one up. It's a sketch of the school itself, but whole again. Bright blue roof. Kids laughing. There's even a cat by the window that doesn't exist in real life. Yet, that hope that imagined restoration is more real than the walls. There's no silence in these places. Not really. There are creaks, whistles through cracks, birds nesting in beams. A child sneezes. Another laughs. And somewhere, someone is heating soup. The lessons carry on. Sometimes Anika teaches with stories, using fairy tales from the old country, but rewriting the endings. The wolf runs off, she says once, because Little Red learned to shout. The kids cheer. That's the kind of twist the war never expected. Outside of Sarajevo, during the Balkan conflicts, women reopened classrooms and abandoned factories. They blacked out windows with tar so snipers wouldn't see movement. Girls and boys crawled in through holes in the floor to avoid being spotted. One of the teachers, Yelena, kept a harmonica in her drawer, not for music class, but for signaling if soldiers were near. Historians still debate whether these schools, built in rubble and fear, could be considered safe. The answer was usually no, but they were necessary. And sometimes, necessary matters more than safe. You catch a glance at the makeshift roll sheet tacked to a board. Some names are crossed out. Some never showed up again. And yet, Anika calls the names each morning anyway. She leaves space for them every day. A quiet defiance against forgetting. Lunch is modest. Potatoes and boiled turnip. Handed out in cups once used for paint water. You imagine complaining about school lunches after this and immediately feel ridiculous. The kids joke, throw pebbles, chase each other around what used to be a playground and is now a crater garden. Anika calls them back with a whistle, a real one, carved from wood by one of the boys. No one talks about what happened here. They talk about spelling. And when class ends, they help her cover the cracked windows with boards. One boy grabs the broom. A girl folds up a mat. No one asks them to. They just do it. Because when your school survives a bombing, you treat it like a cathedral. You step outside and glance back. The sun cuts sharp angles through the shattered roof. Light falls on every corner of the space like a blessing. Tomorrow, Anika will be here again earlier than everyone else sweeping. Setting up the board, ready to teach. Her school doesn't have electricity, accreditation, or even a lock on the door. But it has her, and that's enough to rebuild the world. The snow crunches like sugar under your boots. It's early, painfully early, and your breath clouds the air in short puffs. You follow the narrow path between pine trees, past crooked fences and frozen wells. The wind bites. But up ahead, you see light flickering through a window patched with waxed cloth. You step into the warmth, and suddenly, you're inside the coziest rebellion you've ever seen. The room smells of porridge, ink, and damp wool. The stove clanks in the corner, red with heat. and mittens hang above it like ornaments. Children shuffle in quietly, boots steaming, cheeks pink. At the center of it all is Agnieszka, hair pinned back, sleeves rolled up, and glasses slipping down her nose. She greets each child by name, checks their fingers for frostbite, and gestures them toward the benches. You've arrived at a secret winter school, deep in a rural stretch of Eastern Europe, somewhere between occupied Poland and resistance-era Lithuania. These clandestine schools often run from cottages, barns. Even bakeries were part of what some historians now call the underground education networks, mostly driven by women. Under foreign occupation, be it Tsarist Russia, Nazi Germany, or Soviet regimes, local language and history were often banned. Schools were shut or repurposed to serve the occupiers. But women like Agnieszka quietly said no, and then proceeded to teach anyway. The lessons begin fast. She paces before the children, writing on a small slate board held on her lap. Today's topic: Polish folklore. The official schools have erased those stories from the curriculum. But here, they're front and center. The children chant lines from a poem about the wobble dragon and the cobbler who tricked it with sulfur. Not exactly on the state-approved reading list. The quirky bit: she keeps lesson plans hidden inside loaves of bread. Really? If soldiers enter the cottage? She tosses the bread into the oven and poof. No evidence. The kids know the drill. They become bakers in seconds. One girl once convinced a patrol officer she was kneading dough while rehearsing multiplication tables under her breath. You hear laughter when one boy blurts out that the dragon in the poem sounds like the district officer. The class howls. Agnieszka grins, but gently hushes them. She's careful. She has to be. These schools weren't just illegal, they were treasonous. In Nazi-occupied territories, teaching unauthorized subjects could mean imprisonment or worse. Yet thousands of women ran them anyway. Some even taught from their sickbeds. One story tells of a woman in Vilnius who taught Latin while pretending to be a seamstress. Each student arriving with a piece of fabric and leaving with a new phrase in accusative case. Historians still argue whether underground education helped sustain national identity or simply delayed assimilation. But there's no denying the courage it took to teach a banned language with enemy patrols outside. You sip from a tin cup of warm milk passed around during the break. There's a bowl of dried apples on the table, and a makeshift bookshelf lined with handwritten texts. No covers. Just stitched pages copied from memory. You pull one out. Pan Tadeusz, Poland's national epic, painstakingly transcribed in 3 different handwriting styles. A community effort. Agnieszka doesn't just teach literature. She teaches resistance. The children learn code phrases, geography, the art of silence. They learn how to smuggle notes, how to read maps made from breadcrumbs and thread. You hear the floor creak above, just the wind, she says, but the kids fall silent. Each has a role. One shuts the window flap. Another hides the books in a hay basket. Rehearsed. Precise. And then, just like that, class continues. A little quieter, but undeterred. In occupied Korea, under Japanese rule, similar schools sprang up. Women taught Hangul script by tracing it into steamed rice cakes, letting students taste each syllable before it vanished. Ingenious, right? One teacher even baked history lessons into bread loaves, tiny notes inside like sugary fortune cookies of rebellion. You can't help but smile. Everywhere. And it seems education under oppression becomes performance art. Later in the day, Agnieszka pulls out a thin tin box. Inside, a map of pre-partition Poland. Edges frayed. The children gasp when they see it. They pass it gently, reverently, like it's contraband treasure. In many ways, it is. You ask her where she finds the energy, the nerve, the patience. She just shrugs. They need to know who they are, she says, before someone tells them what they're not. Some scholars dismiss this kind of teaching as nostalgic nationalism. Others claim it was critical in preserving languages that would have died in a single generation. Either way, the impact is visible in the way these children sit taller as they recite lines about forgotten kings and local saints. As the sun fades behind the pines, the children begin to leave one by one, out the back door, spaced minutes apart. Safety first. Each carries a folded paper inside their mitten. A math riddle or spelling word to review at home. Parents know not to ask. They just nod. Agnieszka closes the stove damper and folds the benches against the wall. She's tired. Her back aches. But she's already thinking about tomorrow's lesson. Something about riddles and rhymes, disguised memory games for names of resistance fighters. Education in this form isn't just academic, it's armor. Outside, snow begins to fall again. Soft, steady, like the hush of breath between whispered facts. The school disappears into the forest like a secret too important to forget. And you realize, even in the coldest winter, women like Agnieszka kept the fire of identity burning, quietly, carefully, every single day. The door creaks open with a sound like an old cello string. You step inside and pause. It's not a classroom. Not quite a shelter, but something in between. A long, narrow room. Once a tailor's shop, now crowded with children bent over notebooks and thread. One girl stitches a line of cursive into fabric. Another reads aloud while untangling yarn. And at the center of it all sits Rosa Tiny, stern-eyed and fast-fingered. A needle in one hand and a ruler in the other. Welcome to the sewing schools. Not the kind where you get a certificate and a plaque. No, these were scrappy, make-do havens, often run in the backs of bakeries, basements of churches, or tucked between market stalls where women taught needlework as a Trojan horse for full-blown education. You take a seat on a folded sack. The kind onions come in. It scratches through your coat. But you don't mind. Rosa notices you, nods once, and continues explaining fractions using fabric patterns. A hem takes a quarter meter, she says. If we have 1 meter, how many hems? The girls respond in unison. 4. Seamstresses. Maybe. Mathematicians. Definitely. In 19th century Europe and colonial era Latin America, sewing circles were one of the few acceptable spaces where girls could gather without suspicion. They were supposed to be about homemaking, obedience, quiet hands. But women like Rosa had other plans. They threaded rebellion into every stitch. Mainstream historians have sometimes dismissed these schools as domestic training centers. But newer scholarship sees the subversion. Girls were learning literacy, logic, even politics, all disguised as homemaking. The pattern books hid poetry. The samplers stitched letters of the alphabet before they stitched napkins. You glance at one girl's sampler. Hope is the thread that never snaps. Not exactly your average embroidery, and not something found in the official curriculum. In Bogota, during the early 20th century, A woman named Claribel ran a sewing school out of a flower stall. She used flower petals to color code grammar rules. Verbs were marigold. Nouns were bluebells. Children stitched sentences onto ribbons, wore them in their hair, and memorized entire pages of text this way. Quirky. Yes. Effective. Extremely. Back in Rosa's shop. The girls are reviewing anatomy. You blink. Anatomy. Rosa lifts a cloth doll stitched with internal organs in different fabrics. Liver in corduroy. Lungs in silk. She teaches human biology with a puppet. One girl gasps when she learns the heart isn't heart-shaped. Another asks if brains are really that wrinkly. The room dissolves into giggles. Rosa smiles. Barely. Remember, she says, the brain has folds so it can hold more knowledge, just like a dress has pleats. And with that, the metaphor is stitched forever. You realize, watching her move between students, that this isn't multitasking. It's choreography. She adjusts one girl's grip on the needle while correcting another's spelling. She offers synonyms for fasten while teaching a stitch called whip loop. She's like a DJ sampling 3 languages at once, except with thread. In the American South, during Reconstruction, freed women established sewing schools in barns and abandoned kitchens. Teaching black girls how to read was often illegal or violently punished. So sewing provided cover. One such woman, Miss Letty, embedded alphabet lessons into quilt squares. Each square stood for a letter, a lesson, a name. Years later, those quilts became heirlooms. But to those who knew, they were textbooks in disguise. Historians still argue whether these efforts were formally pedagogical. But when you learn to spell freedom one square at a time, does it really matter what the degree says? The room in Rosa's shop grows warmer with the scent of tea and fresh thread. A kettle boils on a hot plate in the back, and students pass around mismatched mugs. One girl shares a story she wrote about a flying thimble. Another recites a poem about scissors being too sharp for lies. Rosa listens, nods, and lets the applause last. You notice now how many of these girls wear pins, tiny safety pins attached to their collars. A secret club. Sort of. Rosa calls them keepers. Each girl who masters 3 lessons gets 1. It's their diploma, their badge, their tiny armor. No certificates, no bureaucracy, just a gleam of defiance. In occupied Algeria, during the 1950s, a woman named Zahia taught French and Berber poetry behind a textile stall. She wrapped her lesson notes in bolts of fabric and wrote conjugation tables along the selvage edges. The French authorities never suspected a thing. Today, some of those bolts survive in museums, though most people don't know they were. In fact, essays in disguise. Back in Rosa's shop, the clock ticks toward dusk. She holds up the final lesson. How to mend torn sleeves. Some things, she says, aren't worth patching. But you, she glances at them all. Eyes suddenly gentle. You're always worth mending. The girls bow their heads, threading needles in silence. It's almost reverent, like a ritual. One girl hums a lullaby, another joins, and soon the room feels like it's swaying with the rhythm of care. You rise quietly and step outside. The air is cold again. The market is closing, but inside that little room, the light stays on, flickering behind hand-sewn curtains. And you understand. These sewing schools didn't just stitch fabric. They stitched minds, stitched confidence, stitched new lives out of the scraps no one else wanted. Thread by thread, lesson by lesson, woman by woman. You hear the rhythm before you see the place, feet scraping on dusty ground, hands clapping, voices rising and falling in call and response. It's not a classroom, it's a courtyard. The roof is the sky, the floor is dirt, and the desks, there are none, just a circle of woven mats. Children cross-legged and glowing with attention. In the center stands a woman with silver bangles stacked on both arms. She's not holding a book. She's singing. This is Fatuma's story school, one of many oral classrooms born in the Sahel and other arid regions where resources are scarce but traditions run deep. Here, knowledge is passed mouth to ear, rhythm to rhythm, breath to breath. And while outsiders may see only a gathering of children under a tree, you know better now. You slide onto the outer edge of the circle and listen. Today's lesson is about rain. Not the science of it, though, that comes too, but the meaning. The story begins with a girl who climbs a baobab and sings to the clouds until they answer. Between stanzas, Fatuma quizzes the children. Why did the rain stop? What did the girl do? What happens when we forget to ask for what we need? Mainstream historians once scoffed at oral education, calling it primitive or unsystematic. But those same traditions have preserved genealogies, legal systems, and scientific knowledge for centuries without pen, paper, or a single whiteboard. Now, finally, scholars are revisiting this bias and arguing that such schools are systems in their own right. Fatuma claps once, sharply. The children shift gears. A counting game begins. Using pebbles and rhythm, one girl drops a stone with each syllable. One river, two rivers, three goats cross the path. They're doing math, right there in the dirt. No calculators, just melody, quirky twist. Fatuma teaches astronomy using shadows. At noon, she places a stick in the ground, and they watch how the sun bends time. That's your clock, she says. The sky never lies. Her students learn to read the stars not for romance, but for navigation, how to cross distances safely, how to avoid desert storms. This is the school that travels. When the village migrates, the school moves too, sometimes on camels, sometimes in carts. The blackboard, a hide stretched between poles. The curriculum, what the earth is doing that day. You might learn about erosion from watching goat tracks in the sand, or practice writing in the dust, smoothing it away when done. During colonial times, these schools were suppressed, often violently. Colonizers dismissed the teachers, usually elder women, as superstitious, and forbade gatherings larger than a cooking circle. But the stories survived, buried in lullabies, hidden in riddles, whispered while pounding millet. Fatuma's grandmother taught under the same tree, her mother too. And now it's her turn. You look around and realize how tightly woven this place is with language, rhythm, and identity. The children learn French and Arabic here, but also Pula, Tamashek, and Wolof. No formal rules, just immersion. They mimic accents, try new vowel, stumble and laugh. It's multilingual chaos. It's also genius. In the Andean highlands, a similar model thrives. Women teach children Quechua and Spanish side by side, using songs about condors and potatoes. In Mongolia, nomadic herders' wives teach counting with yurt poles, direction with wind patterns. A tent becomes a school. A journey becomes a classroom. You hear a boy ask Fatuma how far the moon is. She doesn't have a telescope, but she does have a bowl of water. She places it on the ground, waits until the moon's reflection appears, and says, if you can see it, it's already close enough to learn from. That kind of answer isn't in any textbook, but you wish it were. Historians still argue whether these mobile, informal schools can scale, whether they can be measured, funded, standardized. But here, where the chalk is the finger and the textbook is the story, none of that matters. The lesson moves again, this time to plants. Each child is given a seed. Find its name. Fatuma says, then learn what it feeds. Tomorrow they'll come back with stories. This one grows near the well. That one cures a fever. This one is poisonous unless cooked twice. Biology through scavenger hunt, with a touch of survival instinct. Fatuma ends with a proverb. A single thread cannot wrap the sky. The children echo it back like a song. Then they break for lunch, racing off with tin bowls and loud laughter. You stay behind, watching her sweep the mats and stack her storytelling calabash like it's a chalkboard. You ask how she learned all this. She shrugs. I didn't, she says. I just never forgot. There's no attendance sheet, no fire drill plan. But this school has something far more difficult to replicate. Memory that lives, moves, and breathes. You could burn the mats, scatter the seeds, ban the language, but as long as Fatuma sits under a tree with her stories, the classroom never ends. You look up. The tree hums with bees. The sun shifts. Shadows creep long. And still, the lesson echoes. A girl murmurs a rhyme about rain. A boy counts with his toes. You walk away, not from a school, but from a living archive, a whispering library, a tradition passed hand to hand, heart to mouth, and somewhere behind you, Fatuma's voice rises again soft, steady, stitched with stars. It smells like rust and boiled coffee. You're standing in the corner of an old train station, long decommissioned, where pigeons coo from the rafters and the air carries the scent of metal, sweat, and something else, hope, maybe. Though it's hard to place, this isn't a school. Not officially. But if you look closely past the crates of donated coats, the folding tables, and the walls lined with mismatched posters, you'll see a blackboard propped against a bench. There's chalk on the ground, and a woman with a clipboard in her hand, and a toddler clinging to her ankle. Her name's Ida, and this is the kind of school you don't find in brochures. A transit shelter turned learning post for displaced families, those in motion. In limbo. In the long pause between leaving and arriving, you notice the sign on the wall. No child too temporary to teach. Ida began this school during a wave of mass migration through the Balkans in the late 1990s. At first, she just translated for mothers' forms, directions, emergency contacts. But one day, a boy handed her a crumpled sheet of math problems and asked if she could explain it. She did. And the next day, 10 more kids showed up with notebooks. Refugee education, especially in transit zones, has always existed in this shape-shifting, seat of the pants form. Women like Edda repurpose benches into desks, baggage carts into book racks, and donation boxes into supply closets. Some historians call these efforts education triage, a desperate patch job. Others call it foundational work for reintegration. Either way, when a child learns to read between two trains, it leaves a mark deeper than any diploma. Today, the station buzzes with motion. Kids come and go, some for an hour, some for a week. Ida knows many by face, few by name. Sometimes I only have time to teach them one word, she says. So I choose a good one, like home or safe. A girl named Zeynep practices her alphabet using chalk on the floor. Her older brother leans against a column, reading aloud from a dog-eared picture book about rivers. We've never seen a river. He tells you matter-of-factly, only barbed wire. You nod, unsure what to say. Ida simply hands him a new page and asks him to read it twice. Slower this time. Here's a quirky bit. Ida teaches geography using old train maps. She overlays them with transparent sheets where the kids draw their own imaginary countries. One boy creates a land shaped like a shoe, with rivers that spell his mother's name. Another draws a border made of cookies. This is where no one shouts, he says. In early 20th century Russia, as people fled civil war and famine, women in transit shelters set up corridor schools, teaching lessons in station hallways between evacuations. They used ash to write on doors and recited history lessons in whispers to avoid detection. A woman named Galina ran one such corridor school and later claimed she taught Tahan. 200 children with just one book in the memory of her grandmother's stories. Historians still argue whether she exaggerated, but they also can't disprove it. Back at the train station, Ida's table is crowded with tasks. She's helping one child sound out words in 3 languages, while another asks what the moon is made of. Dust and dreams, she replies, then gives the scientific answer. 2 balances everything here. Myth and math in equal parts. There's a line on the wall made of red tape. Each child adds a mark next to their height, writing the name of the last place they slept. Some are towns, others are just tent 4 or roadside. It's not a roll call. It's a timeline of motion. The class breaks for snacks, flatbread and cheese, and Ada reminds everyone to share. The golden rule isn't a poster here. It's practice. You ask her if it's hard. Teaching children who might never return. It's not about staying, she says. It's about being seen. If someone taught you even one poem when your world was falling apart, that poem might carry you through. In Lebanon during the Syrian crisis, informal schools like this sprang up in storage depots, mosque basements, and car repair shops. One teacher, Hala, used cardboard for textbooks and taught lessons by flashlight. She used engine oil to darken her makeshift chalkboard and egg cartons for learning numbers. The kids called her Miss Engine. You hear a commotion near the doors, new arrivals. A mother with 3 children, one crying, one staring, one asleep in her arms. Ida greets them with that firm, calm tone. She gives the oldest a pencil, hands the middle one a stuffed bear, and takes the baby so the mother can breathe. In less than a minute, the new kids are seated on the floor, surrounded by books, included. Someone's drawn a mural on the wall, a train turning into a bird, flying toward a sun that's also a clock. The artist, a former student, now relocated, He mailed the design back and asked if someone could paint it. Ida says one of the teenage boys did. Between lessons, you watch as the children practice spelling their names in different alphabets. Latin, Arabic, Cyrillic. Each name spelled in 3 forms, as if preparing for 3 possible futures. And for a second, you see this place for what it truly is: not a shelter, not a station, but a portal. One that lets children pause long enough to become themselves, even just for a moment. As the sun slants across the dusty windows, Ida calls the final activity Story Circle. Tell me something you learned today, she says. One child says, how to draw a river. Another says, how to make space for someone new. And the third, she just whispers, I learned that I matter. The air is thick with heat and chalk dust. Fans whir overhead, their blades coated in grime, barely stirring the sweat from your temples. You're in a warehouse, at least. That's what it used to be. Now it's a school. Sort of. Someone's painted the concrete walls in pale yellow. Desks are cobbled together from crates and doors. And at the far end, pacing between rows of restless, bright-eyed teenagers, is Amira, half teacher, half magician, and completely in charge. This is a factory school, born out of necessity in the early 2000s and refined in crisis after crisis. These schools pop up wherever industry swallows childhood on the outskirts of garment districts. Brick kilns, electronic recycling dumps, where children are put to work. Women like Amira show up, often uninvited, and begin to teach. You're hesitant at first. It feels like trespassing, but Amira waves you over, tosses you a stool, and keeps talking without missing a beat. Today's lesson is economics. If one person makes 10 shirts a day, she says, and each shirt is sold for 20 rupees, how much is the factory earning? The class murmurs, does the math. Then she asks, and how much did the worker earn? Silence. That's the lesson. Factory schools have long existed in the shadows of industrial development. Some started as labor rights hubs, others as relief stations for overworked kids. But under the guidance of women like Amira, they evolved into something radical: education that refuses to wait for ideal conditions. In Dhaka, during the rise of the fast fashion boom, a group of female labor organizers began teaching basic math and reading to child workers during lunch breaks. They printed lessons on leftover clothing tags and used thread cones as number counters. It sounds bizarre until you realize that was the only material they had. Quirky twist. In Amira's classroom, the alphabet posters double as sewing patterns. Kids learn language through the shapes of sleeves and collars. A is for armhole, she says. B is for button. It's not nonsense, it's genius. The kids remember, they use it. Historians still argue whether these hybrid education models compromise the quality of learning. But then again, who gets to define quality? When your blackboard is the back of a shipping crate and your chalk is borrowed from a brickworker's mark line, you define your own standards. A boy raises his hand. Why don't schools come to us before the factory? Amira pauses, then simply says, because sometimes money speaks before teachers do. She doesn't say it bitterly, just honestly, and the kids nod, because they already know. She's built this place without permission. No grants, no title. Just a network of volunteers, former workers. retired teachers, even one woman who used to be a janitor but now runs the math group like a pro. They rotate sessions during the slowest hours of the workday, bribing managers with tea and a promise not to slow production. You watch a girl writing sentences in charcoal on a discarded slab of particle board. She's about 12. Her hands are calloused. Her uniform is a cut-down adult shirt with the sleeves rolled up, but her handwriting is perfect. "My name is Sahana," she writes. "I like to learn because it makes me bigger than the machines." You blink. Bigger than the machines. That's a whole manifesto right there. Back in the 1930s, in industrial Manchester, factory schools for working girls taught reading and hygiene in shifts between textile cycles. One teacher, Miss Blodwen, used fabric scraps to illustrate science lace for lungs. Denim for skin. We wear the body, so learn it like clothing, she'd say. Her students later helped found women's health clinics. Amira reminds you of her. Fierce, inventive, untiring. She teaches between steam blasts and clanging metal. At one point, she holds up a bolt of cloth and says, "This is math. It's geometry, weight, cost, time, and effort. If you understand cloth, you understand the world." Later, she takes you to the corner of the warehouse, where a mural is being painted. It's massive 3 girls holding books made of thread, their braids turning into vines that grow beyond the wall. The artist is 14 and still working her night shift. She paints during her breaks. Near the mural, a stack of textbooks donated. Torn, missing pages. Amira's fixed them with staples and tape. Some are held together with thread. One has a hand-stitched cover that reads, "Our Book of Enough." Inside, you find vocabulary lists, arithmetic tables, song lyrics, and hand-drawn maps. No copyright, no uniformity, but every page alive with effort. There's laughter at the back. Someone's drawn a cartoon of the factory boss with steam coming out of his ears. Amira doesn't scold them. She walks over and adds a speech bubble. "Where are my commas?" The kids roar. A bell clangs somewhere in the building. Lunch breaks over. The students scatter back to their machines, their stations, their real-world obligations. But every single one of them passes by Amira, gives her a nod, a smile, a whispered, "See you later." She nods back, already resetting the room for the next batch. You linger a moment longer. The room empties. The fans still turn, and Amira sits on her stool, takes a breath, and opens a notebook her own. She's writing lesson plans for tomorrow. Because tomorrow, they'll return. And though the world keeps trying to make these children disappear into labor statistics and assembly lines, women like Amira make sure they stay seen. You wake to the sound of hammers, not bells. The morning fog still clings to the edges of the alleyways, and somewhere nearby, a goat bleats impatiently. But here in the middle of this urban mess, a jumble of cinder blocks, satellite dishes, and rooftop gardens, you stumble into a miracle in motion. A rooftop shelter school built from salvaged plywood, corrugated metal, and what can only be described as sheer will. Inside, it smells of sweat, chalk, and boiling lentils. You duck through the low doorway and find Hermina barefoot, smiling, and holding a book in one hand and a ladle in the other. Around her, a dozen children copy words from the blackboard onto scraps of recycled packaging. Someone has drawn a sunflower on the wall with colored soap. A breeze cuts through the space, flapping the tarpaulin roof like a tent at sea. This school wasn't built with permits or funding. It started with one girl hiding from her stepfather on the roof, and Mina handing her a biscuit and a notebook. Then another girl came, and another. Before long, the rooftop was no longer just a refuge. It was a school for the girls the system forgot. Mina specializes in what she calls the in-betweens girls. Too old for public school, but too young to work legally. Girls caring for siblings, escaping early marriages, or surviving homelessness. Some can't write their own names. Others speak 3 languages but can't read any of them. Today, she's teaching biology. Not from a textbook, she doesn't have one, but using a box of vegetables donated by a street vendor. This tomato, she says, holding it up like a precious stone, has more cells than all of us put together. The children gasp, laugh, argue about whether tomatoes have feelings. That's the science lesson. In 1970s Cairo, women ran rooftop and courtyard schools in overcrowded neighborhoods where public services couldn't reach. These sky schools, as they came to be called, used whatever was available. Discarded street signs became chalkboards. Egg crates turned into math tools. Mina's rooftop feels like a spiritual descendant of those early pioneers. Quirky twist. Mina teaches punctuation with spices. Cumin for commas. Cinnamon for periods. Red pepper flakes for exclamation marks. The kids sprinkle them on rice. Stir them into dough. Taste their way through sentence structure. One girl declares that too many chili flakes make her paragraph too loud. You snort, she's right. Historians still argue whether these patchwork schools qualify as formal education. Mina shrugs when you bring it up. No one asks that when boys learn in tech shacks, she says. But when girls learn on rooftops, suddenly it's a debate. The lessons roll on. Poetry mixed with hand-washing drills. Story circles interspersed with first aid. A girl shows off a drawing of lungs made from leaves. Another teaches the others how to fold sanitary pads from cloth. We don't just teach books here, Mina says. We teach survival. Break time arrives, and out comes a bucket of dal and rice. Everyone eats together. Teachers, kids, the neighbor who brings extra spoons. No one's too proud. No one's left out. One corner of the rooftop is curtained off. That's the quiet room. The space for girls dealing with trauma, cramps, or just life. A volunteer sits there with a radio playing old songs and a collection of hand-me-down scarves to braid and unbraid. Healing doesn't always look like therapy. Sometimes it looks like weaving silence back into a noisy mind. In Rio's favelas, women have built similar rooftop classrooms, one famously nicknamed the Sky School of Sugarloaf, where lessons mix samba with spelling. In Manila, a woman named Teresa started a roof school using nothing but chalk, dance, and a stray parrot that learned how to spell banana. No joke. The kids loved it. Back in Mina's space, a girl finishes reading her first full sentence aloud. The others erupt into applause. There's no condescension, only pride. One claps so hard she nearly falls off her stool. Mina steadies her with one hand while handing her a dried fig with the other. Celebrate small wins, she says. They're never really small. On a back wall, someone has painted a timeline, not of history, but of futures. Each girl has written where she wants to be in 5 years. One says nurse. Another says driver. One simply wrote, alive and not afraid. You linger on that one longer than you mean to. As the day ends, Mina hands out strings of shells. You've earned these, she tells them, for showing up, for staying awake, for learning even when the city forgets you. The girls tie them to their bags, their braids, their wrists, little charms of resistance. The rooftop empties slowly, like a dream fading in daylight. A pair of sandals is left behind. A half-finished sentence scrawled on cardboard waits for morning. You ask Mina why she stays up here. Under the sun, risking fines and worse. She smiles. Because down there, they're told they can't. Up here, they just do. The city groans beneath you. Horns, sirens, firecrackers, dogs barking. But above it all, this patch of sky school floats quiet, makeshift, stubbornly alive. And you realize, when society builds no room for girls, women like Mina build it anyway. Upward, outward, rooftop by rooftop, with nothing but guts and leftover plywood. You're not sure you're in the right place at first. The landscape is wide, sun-bleached, and still, a few donkeys graze in the distance. The only structure for miles is a low, cracked building with its paint long surrendered to dust. But then you hear it faint, musical chanting. You follow the sound past a line of old tires painted bright red, and suddenly you see her, Lindiwe, arms open wide, surrounded by children who are rhythmically stomping and counting in unison. Welcome to the Edge of Everything school. This is the kind of school that lives on the margins at the end of dusty roads, behind the final water station, far from cities and signal tower. It exists because someone like Lindiwe refused to wait for funding or recognition. She found an abandoned community center, patched the roof with scrap metal, hauled water in jerry cans, and declared, "This is where learning happens now." You step inside, and it's both heartbreak and hope. The benches are mismatched and splintering. The chalkboard is half covered in goat prints. There's a chicken nesting under a table, and yet the energy in the room crackles with urgency. Like each minute might be the only one they get. Lindiwe teaches here because no one else would. Government teachers rarely reach the remote zones of her country. And when they do, they don't stay. But she stayed. At first, just teaching her own kids. Then the neighbors. Then her cousins. Now there are 45 students crammed into this single-room miracle. Today's lesson: climate science, not abstract theory. No melting ice caps or satellite images here. Instead, the kids measure the width of their water jugs and chart rainfall patterns on the wall with bits of charcoal. One boy explains that the rains now come too late for the maize to grow. Another says his mother moved the goats farther uphill this year. They're not just students. They're data collectors, scientists, community lifelines, quirky twist. Lindiwe uses shadows to teach physics. She hangs a string with a rock at one end and lets the children trace its arc throughout the day. That's motion, she says. That's time. That's Earth spinning while you breathe. Try fitting that on a standardized test. In post-apartheid South Africa, many rural women ran unofficial schools while waiting for government integration plans to catch up. They taught by candlelight, shared smuggled textbooks, and rewrote colonial curriculums using proverbs and local stories. Historians still argue whether these schools should be categorized as transitional or community-led. But most agree, without them, thousands would have been entirely left behind. At recess, you walk with the children to the water pump 2 kilometers away. Lindiwe uses the journey as a lesson in biology and geometry. Measure your shadow again. She tells them, what angle does it make now? They laugh and stretch out their arms, trying to become human sundials. It's teaching without a classroom, a curriculum shaped by walking. One girl brings a textbook, pages water-stained, the spine held together with sugarcane string. Inside are 3 poems handwritten in the margins. One of them is about a girl who becomes the rain because she refuses to wait for it anymore. I wrote that, the girl says, like it's nothing, but it's everything. Back at the schoolhouse, Lindiwe passes around mango seeds. These are your homework, she says. Take 1. Plant it, water it, protect it. She calls this life homework. Each seed, she tells them, is both science and story. How things grow, and how to make sure they do. Her youngest students sit in the back, tracing letters in ash on banana leaves. The oldest ones help them, patiently correcting each stroke. The school doesn't divide by age. It flows like a river, everyone upstream pulling those downstream with them. You notice the wall with names. A roll of students who've graduated, which here means they've gone on to high school in the city. Gotten scholarships. Found apprenticeships. Some names are circled in blue. Those who've come back to teach on holidays. One name has a star. That's my daughter, Lindiwe says, smiling softly. She teaches math now, for real, in a real school. But she says this place taught her everything. There's a single solar panel on the roof, donated by a traveler who passed through years ago. It powers 1 bulb and a tiny radio every day after class. The students gather to listen to news broadcasts in English, trying to catch phrases, mimic accents. It's informal language training, but effective. One boy mimics the radio host so perfectly, you almost believe he's a celebrity. As the sun dips lower, the shadows stretch long across the dirt floor. Lindiwe reads aloud from a book missing its cover. Her voice is steady, full of fire. The children lean in. One rests her head on another's shoulder. A few close their eyes, but no one stops listening. You ask Lindiwe what keeps her going. She looks at you like the question itself is silly. Because they're here, she says, gesturing to the children. They came. That means I show up too. You nod. Because there's nothing else to say. This school may not have a gate, or a flag, or a name painted over the door, but it is a school. It is everything a school should be. Safe, stubborn, curious, alive. And as you leave, you glance back. The chalkboard still holds the day's lesson. A girl is erasing it with her sleeve. Tomorrow, it will be filled again with numbers, stories, questions, with the idea that no child is too far away to matter. The wind hums low through the trees as you follow a footpath lined with river stones. Some hand-painted by children, tiny suns, stick figures. Words like listen and grow. You're not in a city now. Not even close. The mountains loom in the distance, and the air smells of pine, ash, and cool morning bread. You duck under a faded curtain, strung between branches, and enter the last classroom of your journey. But this one's different. No walls, no desks. Just tree stumps arranged in a circle around a fire pit, and a single wooden chest with books inside sealed in plastic to keep out the damp. Here, education isn't separate from nature, it's braided into it. And the woman leading the day's lesson, Nia, weather-worn and warm-eyed, moves like someone with roots in the soil itself. She greets the children as they arrive, one by one, with a nod, a quiet question, and often a laugh. Each child carries a basket, lunch, paper, and whatever they found on the walk over a feather, a stone, a strange leaf. These aren't just trinkets, they're prompts. Today's science lesson begins with a moth wing. This is a wilderness school, forged from necessity and sustained by belief. It began when the nearest village school shut down after funding was pulled and no one bothered to come back. But Nia stayed. She opened her garden, then the glade, then the forest itself. If the government can't find our children, she said, we'll teach them where they already are. She leads a quiet exercise in observation what changed in the forest since yesterday. One girl notices mushrooms that weren't there before. Another finds fox tracks. Good, Nia says. The earth writes back to us, but only if we notice the ink. In 1930s Appalachia, women educators ran forest schools much like this, sometimes called holler classrooms, where children learned under trees with slates in their laps. Lessons often came wrapped in folk songs or framed by herbalism and seasonal planting. Historians still argue whether these schools were impoverished stopgaps or ecosystems of learning. But sitting here, you feel the answer more than hear it. A quirky twist. Nia teaches math with pine cones. The children count spirals, track symmetry, build patterns. This is Fibonacci, she says, handing you one. Nature's favorite math. One boy insists that pine cones are secretly clocks. They open in the morning and close when it rains. He whispers like a spell. There are no bells, no grade. But Nia does mark progress just differently. Each child has a journal tucked into a hollowed-out tree stump. Every week, they write what they've learned, what they've felt, what questions still haunt them. Some don't write at all, Nia says. They draw. They trace bark. They leave answers in moss. You sit in a reading circle beneath an old cedar. One girl reads a story she's written about a bear who learns algebra. Another recites a memory of her grandmother showing her how to tell time by birdsong. A boy shares a poem about wind that sounds suspiciously like a weather report, but with better metaphors. Lunchtime is quiet and unspoken pact with the woods. You all sit and listen. Squirrels chittering, twigs snapping, the rhythmic crunch of a deer somewhere just out of sight. Then Nia calls everyone back with a chime she made from salvaged silverware. In the afternoon, she switches to history. Not through names and dates, but through place. This river, she says, once carried people fleeing war. This tree grew where their fire warmed them. She teaches local stories, ancestor tales, the invisible footsteps behind every fern and stone. When you ask her what she's teaching tomorrow, she just smiles. Depends on the sky, she says. If it rains, we'll do erosion. If not, maybe astronomy. No lesson plan, no bureaucracy, just a pact with place, weather, and time. Toward the end of the day, the children gather around the fire and make learning bundles, small pouches of fabric tied with twine. Inside, they place a note about one thing they've learned. One thing they want to remember, and one thing they're willing to let go. Nia stores them in a cedar chest. Someday, she tells them, we'll open them again. When we need to. The sun slips lower. Shadows stretch. One by one, the children drift home. Down trails that curl through tall grass like veins through a leaf. You sit with Nia a moment longer. She sips tea from a chipped enamel mug, watching the wind thread through the trees. You ask why she's never applied for funding. For a building, for a name on a sign. She chuckles. Buildings collapse. Systems shift. But if a child can learn from wind and stone, they'll never be without a teacher. And so you walk away, not from a classroom, but from a living forest of memory, stitched with laughter and silence and the smell of pine. It's not flashy. It's not official. But it's school, and always will be. So now you rest your head. And maybe part of you is still out there trailing behind in the dust of a refugee station, perched under a mango tree on a rooftop, or walking that shaded forest path alongside Nia and her pinecone math poets. Let the noise of the day fade. The traffic, the scrolling, the deadlines, they can wait. Think instead of thread being pulled through cloth by Rosa's steady hand, of chalk being scrawled across a shipping crate in a garment factory, of a child whispering a new word for the first time, holding it like a seed in their palm. In the hush that wraps around you now, imagine those same children sleeping too on mats, on benches, on the ground beneath the stars, dreaming of worlds they've only begun to name. Because women like Mina, like Ida, like Lindiway, stayed up late, cooked, carried water, carved time from stone, and taught. They didn't wait for permission. They didn't need credentials carved in marble or corridors full of plaques. They had firelight. Phung. A lesson scrawled on banana leaves. A belief that no child is ever too poor, too broken, too far away to be seen. So breathe. Let the stories settle around you like warm blankets. Let the courage of quiet builders fold itself gently into your bones. You are resting now, but somewhere out there, under dim bulbs or starlight or tarpaulin roofs, another lesson is beginning. Soft voices rise. A page turns. A pot boils, and the work continues. End of script. Sweet dreams.